act as a geopolitical analyst and provide an in-depth analysis of the recent missile attack launched by Iran against Israel. Discuss the potential motivations behind Iran's actions in light of the ongoing conflict in southern Lebanon and the implications for regional stability. Include an assessment of how the United States' response, including the warning of severe consequences for Iran, may influence future military and diplomatic dynamics in the area. Additionally, evaluate the potential impact of this escalation on international relations and security in the Middle East. Act as a political analyst and provide an in-depth analysis of the recent statements regarding Iran's potential targets in a military attack. Discuss the implications of the U.S. government's discussions led by President Joe Biden, including the roles of Vice President Kamala Harris and national security members. Evaluate the geopolitical consequences for U.S.-Israel relations and consider how this situation might impact regional stability. Include various perspectives on the possible motivations behind Iran's actions and America's. The U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem has directed all U.S. government employees and their families in Israel to remain sheltered in place until further notice. In the same statement, the embassy highlighted that it reminds U.S. citizens of the need to exercise caution and be mindful of personal safety, as incidents such as mortar fire, rocket fire, and unmanned aircraft system (UAS) intrusions often occur without warning. Prior. The security environment remains complex and can change rapidly. Iran's planned attack came as Israeli ground forces crossed into southern Lebanon as part of an attack against the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. An Israeli official told NBC News that the number of troops that entered Lebanon is a few hundred last week. Israel killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a bomb attack. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi declared that the assassination of Nasrallah and a senior Revolutionary Guard commander will not go unanswered and accused the United States of being accomplices. With all these developments in Iran, the Dow Jones Index fell more than 250 points at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, influenced by the rise in the price of West Texas Intermediate (WTI) crude oil, amid concerns about the increase in influences in the Middle East, an oil-rich region. The November WTI contract rose nearly 3% in late morning, remaining below $70 per barrel. In April, Iran carried out an attack on Israel with more than 300 drones and ballistic missiles in retaliation for the deaths of 2 senior Iranian commanders during an Israeli airstrike in Syria. Most of the missiles and drones were intercepted by Israeli and American forces.